I want to thank my patron supporters who are helping me to make more videos more often. If you'd like to become a patron supporter, please go to patreon.com/TJR, the original. Thank you for watching this video. Happy Halloween, everybody. This is TJR. You know, in my lifetime, I have seen modern zombie films like 28 Days Later. I have seen comedy zombie movies like Shaun of the Dead. But I've never seen the original classic. I've never seen the original Night of the Living Dead. Now, you may be asking yourself, how is that possible that you've never seen this? You have to understand that within my experience, horror is a genre that I have only until recently started to become really interested in. As an example, I never saw the original Dracula until making my English versus Spanish Dracula comparison video. Growing up as a kid, my parents instilled a certain amount of fear into me in regards to watching horror movies. There are a number of reasons why I think they did this. Some of it would have had to do with my religious upbringing, but also I think some of it had to do with the fact that my parents didn't want to have to deal with frightened children who couldn't get to bed at night. I think I'll talk about more on that at another time. But regardless, over the years, as I've gotten interested in motion pictures and in motion picture history, I have grown aware of the historical significance of this film. And as a result, even before becoming more interested in horror as a genre, Night of the Living Dead was one of those movies that has been on my list as one of those movies that I need to get around to. And so this Halloween, I'm going to watch it now for the first time. I should let you know a few things before we get started, though. While I have never seen this movie in its entirety, I have seen a few snippets of it here and there. I've also read quite a bit about this movie, so I walk into this viewing being very much aware of its history and its legacy. So first, I feel I need to share a few obligatory facts about this film. Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968 as an independent horror film. It was written and directed by George A. Romero and co-written by John Russo and stars Dwayne Jones and Judith O'Dea. It was completed on a whopping budget of $114,000. Even in its day, this fact alone is amazing. It grossed $12 million domestically and $18 million internationally. Night of the Living Dead has been regarded as a cult classic by film scholars and critics, despite being heavily criticized upon its release for its explicit gore. In 1999, it was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the National Film Registry as a film deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. So even before I got interested in horror as a genre, I was interested in this film because of its legacy. Now, for my first viewing of this film, I will be watching the Criterion Collection's recent re-release of this film. This features a restoration by MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. So the next time you critique the modern art world, just remember, they restored Night of the Living Dead, you backwards Philistine, you. By the way, if you're wondering, this is a really beautifully packaged item here. I think I will show it off real quick here. It's got some wonderful artwork, and it's a 2-disc set with lots of bonus features, which I'm going to be watching later. And it also has a poster here, even. This looks like a poster, yeah. Oh, here we go. It's got a poster of this creepy face here. And then it's got an essay inside here, which I'm going to read as well. By the way, normally, I always make sure I've seen a movie first before I decide if I want to purchase it as part of the Criterion Collection. So this should let you know how much faith I have in this film going into it. Okay, so I'm going to go watch the film, and then I'm going to come back and give you my thoughts. Okay, I am back. And before I start to talk about this film, a couple of things. Whenever I watch a movie for the first time, I just want to watch it. I do not want to take notes on it. I just want to watch it. I want to experience it and then think about it for a moment. So I did that. I watched the film, took a short break, thought a little bit about what I'd just seen. Then I sat down with the Blu-ray, went back over certain scenes that were still fresh in my mind, and I took some notes so that this reaction and this review wouldn't just be a lot of rambling. Now, before I even get started with the points I want to discuss in this film, there were definitely plenty of times where I'm watching the movie like this, or I'm going like this, and I'll tell you, that's another thing about the genre of horror that I've had to learn about over the years. Growing up in the time period that I grew up in, which would be like the 70s and even the 80s, I think there was this attitude about horror films, especially among dudes, among guys, that I think is all wrong. I think for some of us, and in fact, not even just for some of us, I think for a lot of us, there was this attitude that you go into a horror film as sort of this test of your machismo. Like you're going to show you're not scared when you watch this horror movie, kind of thing. And I know this because of the reaction that I've gotten from talking to other guys within my generation about horror films. The first thing they say, "Oh, I wasn't that scared." It's like, to me, the whole point of going into a horror film is to get scared. Do you walk into a comedy film saying, "I'm not going to laugh. I'm not going to laugh at this comedy film"? No, you go there to laugh. The whole point of going to a horror film is to have the, scared out of you. That's the point of going. And so I go into horror films with that attitude. I want you to, scare the crap out of me during these movies. And this film definitely lives up to its legacy. It definitely lives up to its reputation, not just as a horror film and as a good horror film, which it is, but just as a good movie. And I think whenever you're dealing with genre films, any genre, be it westerns, superheroes, horror, fantasy, science fiction, whatever, you have to be a good film first before you're a good western or a good science fiction. You have to be the kind of film that is good enough that someone who is not interested in the genre can appreciate and enjoy it. So now with that said, let me just give some of my thoughts on this film. So as I watched the film's opening, and I'm talking about the scene where you've got the car driving down the long road and into the cemetery, one of the first things I thought, because I'm a musician and because, I'm so into music, I just couldn't help but think how appropriate the music was for this film. And I wondered who composed the music, as it had this interesting mix of orchestral and sometimes old school sounding sci-fi music. Of course, it wasn't old school back then. So naturally, of course, during my little break period when I decided to go back over the Blu-ray and just, check, credits and all of that, I found out that nobody in particular composed this soundtrack, that the director used cheaply purchased pre-recorded stock music. And this is a great example of how to do a lot with very little. And I think this whole movie is a good example of that, and I'll be returning to that point as I continue with this review. Now, the second thing I noticed is that this is a very meat and potatoes film, in that it wastes no time getting to its premise. We meet the siblings, Barbara and Johnny, driving to the cemetery to visit their father's grave. And as they get out of their car, we get a brief radio announcement that there's been some technical difficulties with their broadcasts. This is, of course, foreshadowing for what's about to happen and for why these two characters don't know what's going on. As they're putting the flowers on the tombstone, we have some conversation between these two characters. And through their conversation and their recollections, we get a little glimpse into their normal lives. I like how these two characters dialogue, how it's written. They talk like siblings who have spent a lot of time together and who stop being concerned with how polite they are to each other. And their dialogue for this time period is very naturalistic sounding. And then the nightmare begins. the two-spot, a lone man walking through the cemetery who is one of the undead. And it's interesting to note that in this film, which started the zombie genre as we know it now, it never actually refers to these creatures as zombies, nor is the word zombie used anywhere in the film. Aside from that quick little radio blurb that I mentioned earlier, we get no information, we the audience, and of course the characters get no information as to why any of this is happening, although we will get more information as the film progresses. Keeping the audience in the dark as to what is happening on the onset of a film of this type is common today in the world of modern films, but I'm not sure how common it was back in 1968 when this film was released. And while I didn't watch a lot of horror films growing up, I did watch a lot of science fiction movies from this time period, admittedly, a lot of it bad, and the genre films from this time period always had lots of exposition explaining what was going on so that you could understand everything before it all actually happened. It was very much tell, don't show, versus the more preferable common style of today where we show, don't tell. So I want to talk about that first zombie that we meet in the cemetery. He looks very little like the zombies of modern films, and I'm sure a lot of this has to do with the movie's budget. Basically, his skin and his hair are very pale, and for all I know, that just may have been how he looked naturally, and maybe he had really gray hair. But it doesn't matter because his performance is effective. Later on throughout the film, we'll see other zombies, and some of them will look more like what we're used to seeing in zombie films than others. Now, you might say this is an inconsistency, but I don't think it's really anything that's that important because of this film's overall tone being so consistent from start to finish. And I think that's one of the really strong aspects of this film, is just how good it is at giving you this really just horrific claustrophobic feeling of terror creeping up on you constantly. Now, I do have to pause here, though, and talk about one thing that kind of made me kind of chuckle. The first zombie apparently kills Johnny, or at the very least, he knocks him out cold when he slams him against, that one tombstone. That when they're having that struggle and that fight. And then after he knocks out Johnny, he gets up and he chases after Barbara. And this is where I kind of smiled a little bit, because I thought to myself, wait a minute, he's got an easy meal right here. Why is he getting up and chasing after her? I would think he would stop and just, start, chowing down. But instead he goes after Barbara. Now, of course, I realize that if he doesn't go after her, that kind of spoils some of the dramatic tension. I'm just going to have to assume that due to budget, it was cheaper and easier to have him keep the plot moving by going after her rather than having him stop to eat while a second zombie chases after Barbara. Once again, I'm sure this is just due to budgetary restrictions. This is just a minor aside, and you won't be seeing me do this too much more for the rest of the film. So anyways, Barbara takes shelter in a farmhouse nearby where she finds a dead woman who appears to be half-eaten. In terror, she tries to bolt out of the house, but is luckily stopped by our film's main protagonist, whose name is Ben, whose car is, I guess, close to running out of gas. Apparently it has a little bit of gas in it, but not enough to get anywhere else. So he tries to take shelter there as well. And as this is happening, we've got more zombies starting to encroach on the house. When we first meet Ben, there's just this little moment. There's no dialogue, but there's this little moment when she rushes out, terrified by the dead corpse she's seen in the house. And she sees the lights from the truck that belongs to Ben. And then we see him close up there, in the lights. And there's this moment where she's not sure. And we are seeing everything through her point of view. And we, the audience, are not sure. For a brief moment, who is Ben? Is he, is he here to help or not? But Ben, of course, is the hero of the film. He is our main protagonist. Now, earlier, I talked about how this film does a lot with very little. Along with the effective use of pre-recorded music, there is also the story device of having our protagonists isolated in this farmhouse as the horror encroaches on them. The rest of the film is just our protagonist trying to survive the night and nothing more. And it works very effectively for the remainder of the film's running time. At this point, they're still in the dark about what's going on, and they're still trying to just figure out and cope with what's going on. And then, of course, Ben has to cope with the fact that Barbara is, kind of just losing her mind at this point. He tries to get her aid to help him, and she's very little help, actually. So Ben has to deal with the encroaching horror, and he also has to basically kind of babysit Barbara. All throughout, I'm just really impressed with how real time this movie feels. It really, even though we're there for the whole night with these characters. This film, of course, doesn't have that running time, but it feels like we're there in real time with them. I think that's very, very effective. So as they're boarding up the house, there is a sequence where our main protagonist, Ben, finally tells Barbara about his first encounter with the creatures, as it's probably about the only word they use in this film to describe them. Now, if you listen carefully during this scene, there's the sound of a cricket chirping in the background. The devil's in the details, and I have to wonder if this was added in post-production or if it was just a happy accident that there was a real cricket in that house that just wouldn't shut up while they were filming this scene. It's a very small detail, but it adds a sense of mundane realism to the otherworldly nightmarishness of this film. By the way, I should add that the audio restoration for this edition was so well done that as I was watching, I actually thought that the cricket was in my home and not in the movie. I actually paused the film for just a brief second and then, oh, okay, that's the movie, and then hit play again. Now later, we find out, of course, that there is a small group of people who have been hiding inside the basement of this farmhouse the whole time. They include an idealistic young couple named Tom and Judy, and an older couple named Harry and Helen. Harry is a coward, not the kind of sniveling coward you normally see portrayed in movies from this period, but the kind who yells very loudly and aggressively and declares his authority over everybody and his need to be right over everybody else. And I think this is a very interesting portrayal. I loved how just a few lines of dialogue between Harry and his wife Helen established pretty much everything you need to know about their relationship. Once again, very good economy of dialogue, telling you a lot with very little.
We'll see when they come begging me to let them in down here.
That's important, isn't it?
What?
To be right, everybody else to be wrong.
What do you mean by that?
Now, Harry and Helen have a very sick child, and finding out that there is an emergency shelter close by, they devise a desperate plan to escape that goes horribly wrong and results in the death of Tom and Judy. And this film's story allows our characters really no time to even absorb what has happened to this unfortunate young couple. So by this time now, the army of the undead outside the farmhouse has become very strong and very large. And in time we lose our other survivors and only Ben is left. So I'll pause now and ask a question. Is it too much of a coincidence that Johnny ends up being the first zombie, or one of the first zombies, to attack Barbara? Yes, it is. But without it, the movie wouldn't be as horrifically ironic. And of course, it's going to get even more horrifically ironic when we get to the ending. The next morning, the militia arrives and kills all the remaining zombies that are in the surrounding area. Ben has been locked in the basement, hears that something's going on, and he comes out with his gun. He's being very cautious, of course. His encounter with the militia at the ending of this film is terribly tragic and horribly ironic. So now I want to pause and talk about the film's casting. The casting of one lone black actor as the main protagonist and hero of a film within an all-white cast is definitely rare for a film from this time period, and definitely would be considered controversial by any major studio. And while I can think of a few films from this time period that had a black protagonist within a largely white cast, there would at least be some white protagonist, or at least one other white protagonist as well, alongside them within the film. While there are characters within Night of the Living Dead who are sympathetic and some that aren't, the only other heroic characters we have are the idealistic young couple that I mentioned earlier. Aside from that, Ben is the primary hero of the film. He's the one who stays cool under pressure, and he's the one who remains heroic and largely not self-serving in the way that Harry is. But I can't help but see an ambiguity when I watch this film's ending and wonder if it was deliberate or not. I can't help but wonder, did this all-white militia just mistake him for one of the ghouls and therefore shot him? Or did they see an armed black man in the window holding a gun, which you can't blame him for having a gun in his hand. There are all these flesh-eating monsters outside. And did they just shoot him, not because they thought he was a ghoul, but because he was an armed black man, and they knew that they could get away with it very easily in this instance?
There's something there. I heard a noise.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes.
In interviews, director George Romero has stated that the casting of actor Dwayne Jones had nothing to do with race and everything to do with the fact that he was simply the best actor who read for the part. And that's the way it should be. But just doing that back then, and I would say even now, is making a statement, whether you intend it to be one or not. And this ambiguity is probably one of the most haunting aspects of this film. Night of the Living Dead is a film that is spellbinding and engrossing from start to finish. It has this sense of real time that puts it ahead of its time. I can see why this movie has had the impact that it has had over the decades. And I'm very glad that I've finally gotten around to seeing it. Those are my thoughts. Please leave yours in the comments. As always, if you like what I'm doing here, please be sure to click a like, click subscribe, and smash the bell notification icon so you can know when I release new videos. Everybody, thank you so much for watching, and happy Halloween.